Hi everyone, it's Mr. Vallejo. Welcome to science class. Today I'll be taking a look at population dynamics. Typically population dynamics is just one aspect of an introductory study of ecology or environmental science. Okay, so let's get going. What is ecology? Ecology is the study of relationships of organisms with one another and their environment. So sometimes we talk about things like predator-prey relationships in ecology. That would be a biotic relationship, or sometimes we talk about the interactions of, say, humans and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's an abiotic interaction because it's an interaction between living things and non-living things. Both of these are topics that we would study in ecology or in environmental science. So, so we want to see how organisms, on a level larger than an individual. We want to see how those organisms react with each other. And we talked about communities and landscape and populations, and all of those are under the realm of ecology. All righty, so most biology textbooks are actually organized on the basis of the theory of evolution, but in the 1990s, people started to organize biology textbooks based on the levels of organization scheme. This is typically represented by an inverted pyramid, like I have in this diagram here. It says your organisms grouped in progressively more inclusive levels of organization. That's going from the bottom up. So a cell, if you get a bunch of cells together, the cell is a basic unit of life. But if you get a bunch of cells together, you have a tissue. You have many tissues together. You get an organ. You have different organs that work together. It's called an organ system. You and I are made up of many different organ systems. We are an individual in a species. But if you get enough humans together, that's called a population. If you take a look at all the organisms in a certain area, that's called a community. If you take a look at the different communities that an organism, say like a migratory organism might live in, that's called landscape ecology. So for example, if you're looking at the monarch butterflies and how they migrate from one place to another, they might winter in Wisconsin, and they might spend their summer days in California off the coast, even all the way down to Mexico. And so it's going to take a butterfly ways a long time to fly from Wisconsin to Mexico, especially if it goes by way of Oregon and California down the coast. So when we study monarch butterflies, for example, we might study their community in Southern California, and we might study their community in Wisconsin. But when we talk about landscape ecology, that is the both of the communities plus the migratory routes in between. So that's what landscape ecology is. I bet you don't find that in your textbook. So you take a bunch of communities and put them together, what you get is a biome. A biome has a particular precipitation and temperature pattern. Like, for example, the desert is a biome that has a high average daily temperature. It has a high difference between the high and the low temperature. It hardly ever rains in the desert. And so less than, say, 10 centimeters of precipitation during the year is likely. So that's what a biome is. Other biomes are the tropical rainforest, the boreal forest or taiga, the deciduous forest, the grasslands, the savannas. All these are different types of biomes. If you take a look at the The ocean, though, the ocean has aquatic ecosystems that are similar to biomes, things like the coral reefs, the open ocean, the rocky shores, the kelp forests. All these are aquatic ecosystems. And if you put all those aquatic ecosystems and all the biomes together, what you get is the area on the earth that has life, and that's called the biosphere. So these are the levels of organization, and here's some verbiage to help you to understand those different, going from the top down. Now, the biosphere is the area of the earth that can support life. Those biomes have the particular precipitation temperature pattern that determines the climate. The aquatic ecosystem is at the similar level as the biomes. Talked about landscape ecology with the different communities throughout the year and the routes that your migratory organism takes as it goes from one community to another. And then a community has all the populations of all the species in a defined given area. And when we have a population, we're talking about just one of the species. So if you define your area as San Bernardino County in California, you can have the human population, and then the community would represent all the living things that would be found in San Bernardino County, California, which actually is larger than some United States. So some states of the United States. So that's a pretty big county, but it would include a study of the human population, but also the population of coyotes, but also the population of hawks. Also, though, it includes plants like grasses. You might look at all the willow trees in San Bernardino County, so that's what makes up the community. Even bacteria can be considered part of the community of that defined area. All right, in population ecology, we study how and why populations do change. We can see that those populations do have, whether they're populations of fish or bacteria or humans, they have the same or very similar characteristics of the population. Practical applications of this study of populations are useful. This information is useful in managing natural resources like fish, like salmon that are going upstream. Fishery is very important these days as a food source that is being diminished. There are parts of the ocean off of Oregon that no longer have a significant amount of commercial fish. Not crazy? You would think that the ocean is full of fish, but there are parts of the ocean that have been so overfished that they are statistically empty of fish. Here's some characteristics of the population that one might study, that a biologist might study when studying populations: size, density, dispersion, and niche. I think I have a slide on each of these. Population size here is a California gopher tortoise. Some people call it the desert tortoise. Some of you in the audience live much closer to this guy than I do. There is actually a California desert tortoise refuge in California City. So let's say you took a look at the population of California desert tortoises, gopher tortoises in the Mojave Desert. That might be a defined area, and you would have a certain population size. Well, the population size indirectly relates to the ability of a given population to survive. Because if you have more individuals, then you have a higher chance that they will encounter one another, and then they'll be able to mate. if you have a low population size, you might have well, you'll definitely have in the same area a much lower chance that the individuals will meet, let alone one male, one female, right? So they have to mate, they have to have one male meet one female in order to mate. And so if you're a California desert tortoise and you're walking around and the population is small, well, chances are lower that you're going to encounter another desert tortoise, and even lower, it's 50-50 ball here. Is it going to be the correct gender? Now that California desert tortoise refuge in California City increases the population density. That means if you take your desert tortoises, you put them all in a 10 square mile area, there's a much greater chance they'll encounter each other. So the population density is the number of individuals of a species per unit of area or volume, and they will be more likely to encounter the desert tortoise there of the same species, and then hopefully it will be one of the opposite sex, and then they'll be able to mate. Now this dispersion happens this way, and the fourth bullet down says it's influenced by environmental and social factors. Here are social factors. The human population is spaced out to a certain degree, and in different cultures and socially, people live closer together. That I know friends in town who have several families that live within one house. We have communities that are newer, where the houses are closer together. We have communities, parts of the community that are all apartments, so people live much, much closer together, right? And so these are influenced by environmental and social factors, just like in penguins. You can see they're spaced out pretty regularly here. Why don't you see two that are real close to each other? It's the social factors. Going up at the top, the most common is the random or variable dispersion of individuals in the population. That happens, actually it's not the most common one, but it's common in the tropical rainforest. The tropical rainforest, TRF, is an example of an area that has random or variable population dispersion. On the other hand, in areas in the tropical rainforest, you don't have to compete for water. You don't have to compete for sunlight. If you're a plant and you have all the sun you're going to want, you have all the water you need. So a lot of resources you don't have to compete for. So there's going to be a random or variable distribution of organisms in this area. Now, when are they evenly spaced, or when are they uniform? When that happens, when the resources are actually sparse and hard to come by. So if you were to fly from, say, Ontario, California, Las Vegas, Nevada, you would see, if you look out the window, you will see the desert, and the desert is filled with these bushes here. They're called creosote bushes. And these creosote bushes are evenly spaced. Why? Because they are trying to maximize the amount of water that they can get. They also, even in their roots, they put out a chemical, which is essentially an herbicide. And so it prohibits other plants from growing around it, so that you can get more water, because then it can soak up the water that's around here, and the other plants, there aren't any other plants. There are other plants that compete against it. I would start to say the most common way is a clump, because if you think of it like if you think of an seemingly endless desert, there might be spots that have small ponds from a spring, or and in that area where you have a spring, some trees maybe pop up, which provide shade, which makes the temperature more tolerable, and animals are attracted to that. So there can be different things that allow for clumping. So you might find a bunch of different animals right there. You might find many different plants here because the soil is more moist because of the spring water. And so is everything just evenly spaced and uniform? No, most commonly the dispersion of individuals in a population is clumped. Okay, and so that's what's going on here. Here's some looks like angelfish, and these guys are distributed in a clumped kind of way, and that is not just people, but fish, not just fish, but plants and bacteria. Also, all these different types of populations follow the same structure. All right, when we're taking a look at population growth, here are some things that we need to consider. And so we're going to have multiple slides on each of these. So let's just go ahead and get started on these. But you can always come back to this slide if you need a list of the topics that are included in this part of today's talk. So the capacity to grow in a population is usually constant, and it can be determined experimentally, but unless you have factors that change, then the inherent rate of growth of a population is built into that population, built into that species. So for example, here's the cockroach. A cockroach has a very high, what we call biotic potential. If everything was perfect, it says here the maximum rate of increase per individual under ideal conditions at the biotic potential. Look at these numbers. A pair of German cockroaches could generate 575,000 offspring in 1 year if all were to live, if all were to survive, if all were to make it to adulthood. One male and one female cockroach would make almost 600,000 individual offspring. They say that if the cockroach was left to its biotic potential, all of the land surfaces on the earth would be covered with cockroaches up to knee high in only 7 generations. Isn't that crazy? I think that's crazy. Another crazy thing is this is not actually cockroaches, it's a plastic toy that you can get through Oriental Trading Company. Here's some cockroaches right there. Cockroaches. They say that if there's a nuclear war, the next species up after humans could be cockroaches. All right. When you study a population, you got to talk about carrying capacity, which is abbreviated with the letter K, because there's all kinds of things like that have a abbreviation as the letter C. You might think of E equals mc squared, C being the speed of light. So we give carrying capacity the letter K. The size at which a population stabilizes in a particular location. It's a carrying capacity. So here's some people dancing. There's me right there. Just kidding. That's not me. But it's a picture I Googled, and these guys are dancing in the dance hall. You can see the limit is 92 people in this room. That would be akin to the carrying capacity of this room. If you have less than 92, people can come in, dancers can come in. If there are more than 92 people in the room, people need to start going out. So size at which the population stabilizes in a particular location, that is the carrying capacity. All righty, idealized models help us understand population growth. So this is one of the times in biology when it is useful to know calculus. We can know this without knowing calculus, but the derivations of the equations are best left to those who are skilled in that branch of mathematics. Exponential growth is when growth is unlimited. Okay, it's also called J-shaped growth or logarithmic growth, or sometimes we just call it log growth. So that's what happens at the very beginning of a population when just a few organisms are in the population and they reproduce unchecked. So that is logarithmic or log growth or J growth, J-shaped growth, exponential growth. Here, this is why it's called J-shaped growth. And you can see the numbers here. The exponent just keeps going up, and as the exponent goes up, you can see the actual number increases. Here's a formula for exponential growth. The population growth rate, or G, is equal to this constant times the population size. So remember, each species has a built-in rate, R for rate of reproduction. And so this built-in rate of reproduction for this species is multiplied by the number of individuals at that moment. And this would be a time when if you were to plot it on a graph, you'd see it's J-shaped, and you can see that this is exponential growth. Now, why doesn't the population just increase unchecked all the time? Well, after a while, there are going to be some things that organisms are going to have to compete for. These are called limiting factors. These influence the maximum number of organisms of one species found in a given area. They're going to run out of rock nesting sites in this rookery here. Maybe they're going to run out of food. In other conditions, they're going to run out of water. Bacteria run out of places to get rid of their waste products, and so they start living in an environment that's polluted with their own waste products. So limiting factors are going to keep the population down to the carrying capacity of that physical location. So this is J-shaped growth. This one is called S-shaped growth or sigmoid growth, or up here, logistic growth. Okay, what you see is because of carrying capacities, instead of going along, and the blue and the red are the same at the beginning, instead of just going with J-shaped growth unlimitedly, then what happens is because of the influence of limiting factors, this line starts to peter out and even out. And if you were to take the slope of this line, then that would be a slope of 0. Right, so S-shaped or sigmoid growth. Now there's a different formula that's a variation of the first one. We introduced this new mathematical factor here, K minus N over K. K you already know is the carrying capacity, and you already know is the number of individuals in that population. And so when N is really small compared to K, let's say you're talking about a lake that has room for 1,000 fish, and you only have 5. Well, 1,000 minus 5, what's that? 9,000? Oh, no, that's 995. Okay, 5 fish is your actual N, 1,000. So this would be 995 divided by K, which is 1,000, which is a number that is very close to mathematically 1. So when N is really small compared to K, then this approaches 1. Now mathematically, when you multiply any number times 1, you get that number. Okay, so if this right here is the number 1, then your formula now changes to G equals R times N times 1, which is what we saw at the very beginning, which is known as J-shaped log growth. All right, so what we know is at low ends, growth is exponential, growth is J-shaped, growth is logarithmic. Now when N is pretty close to K, let's say K is 1,000 again and N is 900, so K minus N is 1,000 minus 900 or 100. Well, 100 divided by 1,000 is 1/10, so it's 0.1. And if I were to say an even smaller number, that number would make this whole thing, or actually, if the N was much higher, much closer to K, then this whole factor is going to approach 0. So when you multiply anything times 0, like this, if this is now 0, then R times N times 0 is going to be 0. So the slope of that line that we saw in the previous picture right there has the slope of 0. This is G equals R times N. This is, if K minus M over K is 0, this whole thing is 0. So at high end, growth is at equilibrium. All right, here's some other factors that influence population. Density-dependent effects, resource competition, disease, stress, exposure to predators, exposure to parasites. All these have to do with the concentration of organisms in a defined space. So if you have more organisms in a defined space, they're going to have to compete for food. There will be more susceptible to diseases. They might have more stress, like people in the city, right? But some factors are not dependent on density, because no matter whether you live in the city or you live in the country, if you're in the middle of a drought, you're going to know that. You're going to have limited access to water. Habitat destruction pays no attention to the concentration of organisms in an area. Trying to build a freeway, you're not really checking to see if there's more mountain lines north or south of the freeway. If you have a population of strawberries growing in Castroville, California, the self-proclaimed strawberry capital of the world. Also, Oxnard, California is known for strawberries, has the Strawberry Festival. Well, strawberries can get wiped out very easily by frost. And so it doesn't matter if you have a lot of strawberries in the field or just a few. That frost is going to come and kill a lot of strawberries. There are different strategies species have. There's 2 different strategies that are mentioned here. One's the R strategies and the other is the K strategies. Now the R strategies says produce mainly or many offspring and grow rapidly in unpredictable environments like bees. Like this plant here, this plant is a century plant and it only blooms every once in a while. But when it's time to bloom, these guys bloom. They live in a desert. They live in areas with very low precipitation. But when it's time to grow, these guys grow and put out a stem very quickly with flowers within a couple of weeks, because they know that they don't know, but there's a very short window of reproduction, short time window where these guys can form seeds and then reproduce. Same goes with these bees right here. So they grow rapidly. And yet, like the bees, they don't take care of their offspring. You just make a bunch of them very quickly, as fast as you can. We, on the other hand, are case strategists. We raise few offspring and take care of them and maintain relatively stable populations. And the letters R and K have to do with the formula that we just saw earlier. Here's some other characteristics of R species versus K species. K species have a longer lifespan, for example, little parental care in a bee, I was saying. High investment in individual offspring. You know, you have bear cubs that hang around for a year. You have human offspring that hang around till they're 18 years old or even longer, 25, 30, after the, or because of the pandemic, people live with their parents for longer amounts of time. So what about us? Are we R adapted or K adapted? We are obviously K adapted, but we have this kind of curve. Where are we? This is an older picture. 2013, still going up. 2028 will still be going up. Will there be a time when it starts to level out? Or could it be that as time goes, this will always be logarithmic growth, because we will always find some kind of solution to our limiting factors? Or we could immigrate to somewhere else. We're working on traveling to Mars. Maybe consider colonizing the moon. But why not colonize the oceans? Maybe we can live underneath the oceans, or build things that float on top of the ocean. Or there's so much land that we don't have. Here's a number which will amaze you. They used to say 20 years ago that we took all the people of the world, all 6 billion people of the world. It's more like what, 8.5 now. And we took all 6 billion people of the world and had them stand up, and with enough room so that they could swing their elbows around, we could put every single one of those people in Texas. What? Tells you how big Texas is, but it also tells you that, really what it is not just size, but it's also resource distribution that is a limiting factor for the human race. So what about us? Well, our population's going up, for sure. There's what, over 7 billion people on Earth. And then the population is rapidly still increasing in many countries. All right, so human population doubling time every 35 years. By 2067, we'll have 13 billion. Wow, that's a lot of people. That's twice as many people as we have right now. All right, so let's take a quick look at mortality and survivorship and how that relates to human populations. This is an organizing slide. Let's just go right into this. There's an intrinsic rate of increase that depends on age and reproductive performance. If your population is older, you're going to have lower reproductive expectations. Are these guys going to have a baby in this picture? Probably not. And if the population has a lower, maximum population or reproductive age, then it'll have a lower expectation of a rise in population or population rate. So this built-in rate depends on the average age of the population for the population. And so if you take a look at developing countries, they typically have a much lower average age. So because they have a much lower average age, you're going to have more time to reproduce and you expect more offspring in that case. All right. For individuals, there's something called mortality, but the population has a survivorship curve, and that survivorship curve is fairly consistent for different species. If you take a look, here are 3 different species and their survivorship curves. Here's an oyster, and the oyster basically makes as many organisms as it can when it's mating. It makes like 5,000 at a time, but most of those are going to be filtered out and eaten by something else, and very, very few are going to make it to adulthood. That's what happens right here. This represents 100% of the organisms that are made. Well, most of them die pretty quickly, but some of them do live on to the maximum lifespan of the population. Here is humans. Most humans will live to some percentage of the maximum lifespan. My wife's uncle is 101 years old. Wow. Not many people make it to 100. And I went to his 100th birthday, gosh, 2 years ago. He turned 101 a few months ago. So I remember going to his 100th birthday party, but I also saw him on a 101. Wow, most people do not make it that far. This represents the maximum lifespan. But most people don't die early in life either. Let's say that the average lifespan is 82. Okay, well then some people are in accidents or have cancer, and some people die out. But look, most people are still alive right at this point in their lifespan. But there comes a time when, in this area right here in red, where a lot of people are dying. I remember talking to my mom when she was older. When she was in her 70s, I would call her up once a week at least because I lived 6 hours away. I'd say, "Hey, Mom, how's it going?" She would say, "Hey, do you remember Mrs. Garcia?" I said, "Of course I remember Mrs. Garcia. She was my daughter, my ex-girlfriend's mother," something like that. And my mom would say, "Oh, she died last week." Well, all kinds of. There was a time when a lot of my mom's friends were just dying off, and that's what's happening right here. You see the slope of this line is pretty steep until there's hardly anyone left, and then here's the maximum lifespan of the species. 113, 115 years old. By the time you guys get there, there'll be a much higher percentage of individuals that make it past 100. Wow. So that's called the type 1 survivorship curve. Oysters are type 3. Squirrels are type 2. Squirrels have a certain amount of squirrels that are born, but they pretty consistently die off. Why? I don't know. Fall out of trees. If they go to my, my backyard, I have 2 Labrador retrievers, and if 2 squirrels get in there, maybe one's going to be left, because my dogs like to play with squirrels. And so there's a, pretty steady decrease in the number of squirrels. And there are fewer and fewer of them that are older and older. Okay, so that's type 2. If you are interested in the study of populations and you like numbers, well, then you like to look at what are called demographics. Okay, so here's one that's rather interesting. Here's a country that's an example of a rapid growth country, Afghanistan. You can see, as I mentioned earlier, you can see that it's pretty wide at the bottom. At the bottom, this represents very young people. You can see here in slow growth in the United States, it's pretty consistent throughout all the different age groups right there. And then over here, here's some Western European countries like Italy that actually have a population that is decreasing. And so you see something like that. You also see this line that's going down the middle here. Pretty much the same on both sides. That represents male and female. Sometimes you can see a really small male population, and that represents males that were killed in war. Later in life, the frequency of females to males is much higher. So like there are more female women age 80 to 85 than there are males age 80 to 85. And so you can see a difference right there in all of the different countries. And so basically though, you want to take a look at the bottom right here, then you can see that if you have a wide base at the bottom, if you have a population that is that has a much lower average average age, then you see that this population right here is a rapidly growing population. So rapid growth, slow growth, and a decrease right there. Oh, and that is our last slide for today. So if you have any questions, great, hang around. If not, let's go ahead and say goodbye for now. I'm Mr. Vallejo, and this is Population Biology. Thanks a lot. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for class.
Bye. You're welcome.